The gospel this week, and actually the following 2 weeks, will be in the 25th chapter of Matthew. And the 25th chapter of Matthew is all about the end. That is, it's all about death and judgment. So, this morning, thinking about death, and secondly, some things you can't borrow. So first, thinking about death. Thinking about death isn't something that we do much of. We don't like to do it. We even use euphemisms around death. We say, that he passed away or the departed. As much as we don't like to talk and think about death, the church, on contrast with that, encourages her faithful to think about death. And it sets aside an entire month, the month of November, to think and meditate upon our own death. It's always been encouraged to do that, and you even think back to the traditional bedtime prayers for little kids. You may have learned the traditional prayers or as a kid, and your parents taught you, or you've taught your kids, and just think of the bedtime in general. And bedtime, it's a very tender and quiet, cute time with putting little kids to bed. It's very tranquil. You got, mom and dad places Johnny in bed. He lies down. Johnny's head hits the pillow. He smiles. The covers go on up. He gets a little comfortable smile on his face. And then maybe dad gets on one knee and says, "Okay, Johnny, now let's recite our nighttime prayer." And they say together, "Now I lay me down to sleep." It's it's such a nice, this feels so good. "I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." It's there you go, Johnny. I'm going to turn the lights off now. Sweet dreams. Have fun thinking that you might not wake up in the morning. It's what kind of sick and twisted prayer, or sick and twisted parents say that to their little kid when they go to bed? But in fact, it's a great prayer. It's an important prayer. And maybe it's most especially important for adults to think about death. I buried someone just a number of months ago. Her name was Ruth, amazing woman here. I was meeting with the family. She had four children, and was meeting with the family. The children made a point to tell me that mom, she always prayed to have a happy death. Mom always prayed to have a happy death. And that's actually, again, a traditional thing. There's prayers and, to pray to have a happy death. But I just got to thinking, what does that mean to have a happy death? It can mean on two levels, on a subjective level and also on an objective level. So a subjectively happy death has to do with the circumstance of the death. And so Ruth, this woman, for example, she died in old age, 91 years old, with her 4 children at her bed. Beautiful. It was beautiful. But that's not always the case. We know some of us, I have burned in my memory sometime. I was at someone's deathbed, and they literally reached from the bed and pulled by the collar one of their loved ones down to them as they said, "I don't want to die." And of course, just tragic deaths. There's nothing happy about those. They're awful. But in the end, death is either objectively happy or it's objectively sad. Death is objectively sad if the person goes to hell. And it's objectively happy if they go home. And it is possible to have to have a subjectively happy death, but have an objectively sad death. And vice versa. Which brings me secondly here to some things you just can't borrow. There's part of the parable that we just heard, part of the parable that just doesn't seem to make much sense. It sounds like Jesus is praising these 5 virgins for being selfish. You got 10 virgins, 5 wise, 5 foolish. The 5 of them have enough oil, 5 of them don't. These 5 who don't turn to the 5 that do, that have enough, and say, can we have some of your oil? And they say, no. Go get some yourself. It's like, what's up with that? And you ever hear the importance of sharing? Jesus has got to be getting to another issue, another point. He's making a point in the parable. And the key is, what is the oil? What's the oil? And the best way to describe what the oil is comes in the marriage ceremony. When the bride and groom stand right here before the priest or deacon, and before they can get married, the priest or the deacon asks them a question, and he says, have you come here to enter into marriage? Which, by the way, what's the parable? It's a parable of a getting into the marriage banquet. He says, have you come here to enter into marriage without coercion, freely, and wholeheartedly? And I need to hear them both say yes. I need to hear them both say it. Otherwise, they're not getting married. Nobody can come up and on their behalf say yes. Nobody on their behalf can say, I love you. That's the oil. That's why it can't be borrowed. And so the church does encourage us to think about death, but thinking about death isn't enough. St. Alphonsus Liguori wrote a book called just on the preparation for death, and in there he says this: it is folly to not think of death. It is greater folly to think of it and not prepare for it. So to be clear, the 5 foolish virgins, they were not evil people. They ultimately did get the oil. Like, they had the oil at the door. In that sense, they're no different than the wise virgins. They had the oil. They were not evil. They were simply lazy. They were unprepared. They didn't prioritize in planning for the long haul. They lived for the now. And when the time came and ultimately they went to the door and they knocked, the door represents just the time of death. And the answer on the other side is judgment. They were subjectively happy. It's like they're knocking on the door, and what was the response? The bridegroom, Jesus' response was a surprising, shockingly disturbing answer. I do not know you. Because you can't share the oil, which is, maybe to go back to Ruth here, when I visited her in the hospital and I gave her last rites, at one point as I kind of got right up next to the bed and right there next where her head was, and I pulled out a crucifix and I placed the crucifix in front of her face before her, and as I just held it there, she smiled and says, oh yeah. As she could barely speak, very whispering, very weak, she said, I know that guy. And it wasn't, I know that guy, like I know facts about him, or I know what he did, or things that he said. The I know that guy was a tender, very intimate, I know him. I'm friends with him. I love him. I've prioritized him. Nobody else is just in the sixth grade confirmation class was standing in there. Nobody's telling them, now your parents' faith, your parents, what they did when you stand before judgment, no one else's faith can stand in for you. No one else's love can stand in for you. And so the question for us is just, I think this is, do I know him? Do I know that guy? Do I love him? Have I prioritized him? So think about death. We want to think about death, maybe especially here in the month of November, even maybe going to bed, and as the traditional bedtimes children's prayer makes to the point to say, you may not wake up. But we can, as Christians, as St. Paul says in our second reading to Thessalonians, as Christians, we look at death and we can have great hope because one has conquered death, went to the cross, died for our sins so that we don't have to die and that we can live forever.